Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 9 of Teacher Talk with Doc Rocker. As always, I'm your host, Russ Downey, and with me today is Danton Arlotto, also of Doc Rocker Music.
Hello.
How's it going, Danton?
It's going well. How about yourself?
Oh, pretty good. Just chilling inside the house and not being able to go anywhere.
Yeah, same. Definitely thankful this time of year that, at least we have a really good way to pass the time aside from music making and music teaching. And that is a mutual love of both of ours and the central focus of our topic for today, video game music.
Oh, I'm going to have fun with this
one. We've touched on this really briefly in episode 1. So we're going to kind of dig in a little bit more with this topic today and kind of talk about especially, its reputation. It kind of gets a bad rap as being like it's not real music, it consists of being played by toys for kids and stuff like that, and it's really a crying shame. I mean, I could easily just get on the box and do a whole big case to defend video game music, but yeah. So we're gonna talk a little bit more about the genre, especially for a not familiar audience. Especially all you other teachers that are tuning into the show. That night. I'm sure you get your piano kids that want to learn to play music from their favorite games, and it can be a bit of a strange world if you're not in it as an outsider. So hopefully we can kind of shed light on some of the really good qualities about this whole medium and kind of enlighten you on some ways you could incorporate it into your teaching, whether that be private teaching or even in Russ's case, he's got some experience using video game soundtracks in his public school general music settings. So we got a lot to talk about. Let's get started.
All right. Well, I figured kind of the first thing we would talk about is, again, that validity and legitimization problem that video game music faces. And it's kind of funny because we've been on this box before about rock music. But we're going to get back on that one again for video game music. And kind of, I wanted to ask you, and I'll take a turn with this as well, but, we are of the opinion that video game music is a valid source for music education. But Absolutely. What do you think it is that causes that bad reputation?
Well, I'd like to start really quick with a quote by Shigeru Miyamoto, who is pretty much the Steven Spielberg of video games. Anyone who doesn't know him, he's the dude that's responsible for Super Mario, The Legend of Zelda, pretty much half of Nintendo, and all of its famous intellectual properties. Pretty much this guy's behind it. Star Fox, the list goes on. And he has a really interesting quote that I love. I actually have it on my Facebook page for my own personal profile. It says, "Video games are bad for you. That's what they said about rock and roll." And I think that's really, really interesting that we kind of talk about, like we're sitting here a few weeks back, getting into an academic discussion about rock music and defending its legitimacy. And now here we are having the same conversation about video game music. The two are really so similar to each other in a weird way, even though they got nothing else in common. They're kind of bastardized. And
they occupy this space of looking from the outside in,
Yeah. From an outsider's perspective, it's really tough to get into it. And I think a big problem that someone who doesn't know any better about the genre, kind of you think of video game music, the first thing that comes to mind is the really old school chip tunes from the old 1980s arcade cabinets, things like Pac-Man, things like Dig Dug, things like the original classic Mario Bros. That doesn't really have any actual compositions, but short little jingles. It's a little more, there's a whole bunch of reasons why the music was like that in the early days, and it's really come significantly far since. And that's something we'll definitely get into together today, I'm sure. But yeah, I think a big part of it is people just don't know how far it's come. Because you say those three words, video game music, and you think 1982, the original Donkey Kong with a little 5-note thing, and that's it. That's the extent of the music in that game. And they fail to realize, well, and especially on top of that, a lot of those older arcade cabinets just use little snippets of public domain music, just like a lot of the old time movie scores did. Let's just pull this earlier romantic period stuff. Let's just pull these dated classic pieces because we don't have to worry about copyright infringement. And the same thing was applied to video games in the earliest generation. And it wasn't really until, I'd say, the mid-1980s when you started getting the home console market, where you started having hired sound designers and composers to actually make original content for the games, because now we had more sophisticated hardware that can store more memory and have more of that stuff to really further individualize your games. Going back, Super Mario is one of the case in point with that whole idea of it has a full-fledged soundtrack that was composed by a pianist and a musician and a composer. A professional composer was hired just to be the sound designer for Nintendo for this little 8-bit game that wasn't even sure it was going to be anything of anything, and then it revolutionized the industry. And it's
Basically
nuts.
saved it.
Yeah, single-handedly, absolutely.
Okay. Well, I mean, you're right on the mark with that one too. I think another part of it too, with the reputation problem, actually comes from the way the soundtracks sounded in the early days.
Oh yeah, definitely.
And this was again the history of video game music is really
Sounds
kind
like
of like it's like a history of like digital synthesizers and computers mixed together, really. Because what you're looking at essentially what is a specialized computer with a specialized sound chip that can only do so much. It's kind of like a underpowered synthesizer, if you will. And we're talking like, video games getting started at a time where synthesizers could maybe play 6 notes at a time, 7, 8, maybe tops, for like a several $1,000 keyboard being used by like, professional musicians. And this is meant to be a video game console for children, essentially, at least at the time.
And, older kids were definitely the market audience. It wasn't until much later that they started having games for adults too.
Exactly. And the thing is that, a lot of that early video game music, like for those of you out there, if somebody said, think of a video game music, most of you are probably going to reflexively start humming the Super Mario Bros. Like overworld theme, which is the ba-dum, bum, ba-dum, bum. Pretty much everybody knows that. And if you don't, you've been under a rock since 1985.
Yeah, pretty much.
So the thing there is that while it sounds like a tune, it doesn't really sound like any instruments, so to speak, at least not that far back. And I think that's a large reason why soundtracks wound up having that legitimization problem, is because it's really been only until, I would say probably about 2006, 2007-ish, about like the advent of like the Xbox 360, PS3, like era of video games, that we had soundtracks with really strong sound libraries, and even some soundtracks having actual true like instrumentation.
Live recorded instruments.
Wasn't Super Mario Galaxy one of the first ones to actually have recorded instruments?
Yeah, and that game came out in 2006 for the Nintendo Wii, and that featured a fully orchestrated soundtrack. And the soundtrack was actually sold separately for purchase, which I thought was really, really interesting. That was a dream come true for me, because I grew up loving all of the classic Mario tunes, and that was a big part. Funny enough, anyone who knows me knows that video games are a really big part of my life. And in fact, the reason I got into music in the first place was because of the music I heard in the video games I was playing as a child. And that was a big part of why I wanted to take piano lessons and start to if I could play all that cool little Mario tunes and Donkey Kong tunes and pick all that stuff apart on the piano, because I could hear it and I could kind of make sense of it, but I don't know any of the notes and scales and how it all works. So that was a big part of the impetus behind me even taking lessons in the first place. And as I grew up, there was always that, like, I took lessons because I wanted to play all these chip tunes and I wanted to kind of unpack all those secrets. And as I grew up, so did the medium. And now by the time I was like a teenager in high school and getting ready to pursue a career as a professional musician and teacher, here now we've evolved from those little chip tunes on 8-bit technology, 16-bit, all these little synthesizers and kind of hokey toy-like sounding things. And now all of a sudden the next Mario game features a full orchestra. It was mind-blowing for probably not just me, probably for tons of gamers and game music fans at the time, So anyway.
No, I mean, you're exactly right. I mean, that's part of the thing, is that it's still an evolving art form, so to speak. Although it has changed the way a lot of soundtracks sound in certain circumstances, because, and we'll actually get to this in a little bit, talking about like the actual, like the technological limitations of a lot of hardware that caused composition to be the way it was. But one of the things we'll talk about is like how it's changed and what was different with the earlier stuff versus more modern stuff as well. So it's an ever-changing art form. Like we take a look at rock music, we were, kind of drawing parallels to that before, but even though rock music is still around, the core like rock music basically was pretty much done by about the mid to late 90s, give or take. So I wouldn't say it was gone. It was just like what we would consider to be like that era of rock pretty much closed when grunge was basically done.
Yeah, it definitely lied dormant for the better part of a decade.
And what happens is that, like, once you get to that point where like a kind of an era of something is done, it can start being analyzed and being used for different things. We're still in essentially an evolving art form. even though now the technological standpoint that it's at, you can do something completely digital, or you could do something with full orchestration, because there's no longer really the limitations. It's as much as you could do on a computer, you could do on a game console when you're developing for it. But we're still in that era of things are still kind of changing as we go through it. And I think that's what makes it a little bit more difficult to approach it, but it doesn't mean that it's not a valid thing to approach. And I can tell you one thing, in any circumstance I've used it to teach, students always love learning video game music because it's what they're into. It's what they play. It's especially things like
what they hear every day when they're playing their games.
I can't tell you how many students I've had that, like, given half a chance, they're just like sitting there playing Minecraft music in the middle of a rehearsal when we're not doing something.
Yeah.
And even though our generation kind of missed Minecraft by about a good 5 or 6 years, it doesn't mean it's not legitimate. It's actually a thing that, like, it kind of harkens back to a lot of memories that all of us have from our childhood. And the funny part, and Dan, you could probably talk about this as well, but no matter how old the soundtracks sound, it doesn't really denigrate it in our eyes for those of us that grew up with it throughout our childhood. Like, I take a listen to something like the Ocarina of Time soundtrack, Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time from 1998 for the N64, and the MIDI sounds were not great.
Primitive at best. You know, it's like general MIDI sounds.
Right. And for those of you that may not know,
MIDI
stands for, I believe it's Musical Instrument Digital Interface.
Correct.
So, basically what it is that it was a way to compress down the size of files for being put on game cartridges earlier on, or if you were a Nintendo fan, still on cartridges later on, or on discs. And a lot of what it was is, instead of actually like recording the instruments being played, which took up more space, they would basically write down directions for where a particular note was going to be played, how loud it was, basically like the velocity of how hard you would hit the key, what type of patch was being used, and it would be written down that way. And then the system had a sound chip that would decode that and basically play it as it read it off the set of instructions, which saved a ton of space, which was really instrumental, not to make any puns, in what really helped get video game music off the ground in the early days. But later on, when we started to have better sound libraries where the instruments started to sound
more like the real life
actual instruments,
yeah,
it's primitive sounding at best. But you won't hear most of us who grew up at that time saying, yeah, this sounds awful. No, it still sounds fine to us. We still interpret it as sounding like those instruments, which I think is a really interesting phenomena.
Yeah. Yeah, the thing I like about that is that it leaves a lot to your imagination. Like I can't tell you how many times I would sit there listening to my favorite soundtracks, especially from that 1990s period with the Super Nintendo, the Sega Genesis, the Nintendo 64, where the Nintendo 64 was like the strongest thing until the next generation. I remember listening to all those like rough MIDI mock-ups of all these old tunes, but like in my head, I was hearing the real instruments playing them, and to me, it sounded like this beautiful movie score. And I would constantly be ranting and raving about all my favorite game soundtracks. And those who don't know me know I have a bunch of older family. Like, I'm one of the youngest of my family. I have 2 older brothers and a bunch of older cousins, and we all lived pretty close together. And I can't tell you how many times like they would like come in my room and hear me listening to like the Ocarina of Time soundtrack and, oh wow, Danton, you got to start listening to some real music, man. This isn't real. This isn't. And like, I was always so aggravated by that because like, did they not hear the same way that I heard it? You know, like I actually hearing the music on the flamenco guitar, actually hearing the string orchestra, actually hearing the pizzicato, the woodwinds, the percussion. It was just stuff that was so colorful and fun for me. And especially since I didn't have a classical background, this was like kind of like my gateway into some of that sort of stuff.
Right.
And that's another point that we're going to get to, I know, pretty soon. But yeah, for me, like a big part of it was like, it just let me enable my own imagination to run wild. And it was a really early way for me to get a taste and an ear for not only different harmonies and scales and keys. You know, I attribute a big part of how strong my musical ear is to listening to video game music, because we grew up in an era where you couldn't just pull up the sheet music online or find a YouTube tutorial that rains down all the notes to play Super Mario. We had to figure it out for ourselves. And it's something I lecture to my kids all the time. I always say, like, back in my day, we didn't have the internet and you couldn't just find everything. So I just had to sit there with a Game Boy next to my head and just listen to the same loop over and over and over at a piano and try to figure out. And that's a big part of how I got really good at transcription and dictation and harmony and key and so many things. And it's funny, I attribute so much of that to just listening to video game music growing up.
The funny part is that, like, before I even started playing piano, when I was still just a percussionist beforehand, I should probably use the term drummer because all I played was drums, although I wasn't playing any pitch percussion at the time. I was still trying to figure out tunes from like the original Pokemon games on a keyboard, but I really had no great idea of like what the notes were if I were reading them, but I was figuring them out by ear. So I attribute that for some ear training as well. And I remember being really, really happy when I was able to figure out stuff like how it would go. I remember being super happy when I figured out like the red, blue, and yellow like gym leader battle theme, and I was like so proud of myself.
Oh yeah, it's so epic.
Oh yeah, and the thing is that like it's interesting too because in a situation like Pokemon, you actually got to hear an upscaling of the music in real time because you had the original games being for the Game Boy, which was at that time a 10-year-old piece of hardware, which could play like what 3 notes at a time, I think. And
I think
maybe
it might have had 4. I
think the 4th channel was like sound and percussion, basically.
Yeah, like the white noise channel, basically. I think
Yeah.
it was set up exactly the same as the 8-bit consoles of the previous generation. I could be wrong on that, though. I'm a little fuzzy on some of the technical stuff.
As far as I know, I think that's correct. I think it could play 3 pitches at a time in 1 noise channel. And the funny part is like hearing those soundtracks there and then hearing them being put on something like Pokemon Stadium, which came out a year later.
On the Nintendo 64, this vastly superior piece of hardware.
Exactly. And just hearing the difference, and I'm like, oh my God, this sounds so realistic. I don't think it could get any better than this.
Little did we know.
But even that, it's like, you know, for those of us who grew up with it, and even for those that are younger or older than us, you know, hearing that in real time, it doesn't seem like it's something that doesn't sound realistic to us. And I think that's something that always has a knock against it unless you live through it. I think that was a big part of it. But actually, it's funny, we should, you know, talk about something like the earlier consoles and the Game Boy itself, because one of the things I did want to talk about was what the technological limitations did to composition when it came time for video game music. Because Danton, as you could attest, video game music can have strains of being different styles, whether it be like, you know, something more classical along the lines of what The Legend of Zelda did, whether it be during like Nintendo's Latin jazz Mario phase in the 90s, or the occasional ragtime piece from Super Mario World.
You could always trace a lot of elements of different forms of jazz in Super Mario's music. I think that's a big part of why I like it so much, because it's kind of like a simplified, sort of watered down jazz where you get some of those jazz harmonies and some of those kind of song structures and, you know, melodic shapes, but it's not quite so far off the beaten path as someone who's kind of an outsider with jazz music.
Right.
Anyway.
Well, I think that's actually one of the cool parts that we want to talk about later is how it serves as like a gateway into those different styles. Because for a lot of us, you know, my first, you know, introduction to anything sounding remotely like ragtime music came from like the athletic theme from Super Mario World. I mean, that was my first thing. Like,
it's literally written as a piano rag.
Yeah, exactly. But like way before I would have ever heard, you know, a music teacher show me like the Maple Leaf rag in like, you know, 5th or 6th grade talking about ragtime music. I'm like, oh, you mean like this from Super Mario World? I saw this when I was like 5 years old.
But, you know, I had the same exact experience as you, man, with that.
Or even like, you know, more ambient music. Like, Dan, I know I could give you time to, you know, go on and gush about the Donkey Kong Country soundtrack, especially the second one.
Oh yeah, so the Donkey Kong Country trilogy was released for the 16-bit Super Nintendo Entertainment System in the 90s. I think the first one was 94 and then 95, 96 respectively. And at first it was the whole game was developed by a British developer called Rare. And for the first game, they had a team of composers, and the whole aim, like, you know, long story short, they basically had this special piece of technology that made the game's graphic appearance look very realistic for the time. It was, you know, it's still the graphics today of the game really hold up as something special and, you know, a visual sight to behold. And they wanted to supplement that with an ambient soundtrack that reflected realism. That was kind of the whole aim of the first game, was realism, these realistic environments with this realistic music. A lot of times there was use of a lot of ambient noise, you know, animal sounds, and, you know, when you're in these like mine shaft caves, there's like clinking of hammers and all kinds of, you know, like when you're in the cave levels, there's like dripping water and falling stalactites, and all that kind of stuff was just imbued within the soundtrack. And that carried through the sequels as well, even though the sequels got a little less emphasized on the hyper realism of the first game, and they were a little more like, all right, this is a video game, so we can do some really goofy stuff and get a little more imaginative. So I mean, all three of those soundtracks are fantastic. The first of which is interesting because it's the full team, and then the second game was just by one of that team, and then the third game was by another of that team. And I mean, that's a whole topic for a different day. We could talk about, you know, like the different composers that were.
I just wanted to give you a chance to talk about it too, because like out of any soundtrack I've heard from that 90s era of video games, it does a greater job of ambient sound.
Yeah,
Than
and
any other system I've
a lot of
ever
the
heard.
tracks are significantly long in length. A lot of the loops are, some of them are nearly or over 2 minutes, which is a
Yeah,
long time for a game loop. You know, most of your loops are anywhere from 30 seconds to a minute and 30
60 seconds.
seconds at the
Yep.
most. You know, they're usually really short because the games are made to be fast paced, where you're only
Right.
at that particular stage of the game for a minute or two at a time, and then you go to some other scene and there's a transition, and then you go to some other thing. There's all different sorts of layers of music that get put into the game soundtrack, which is another
Mhm.
thing that I think is very shameful, and how it gets so kind of criminalized is like not being real, because like so much work and effort and talent
Oh
goes
yeah.
into making these game soundtracks, and
Just wait until we
as a
talk about the
kid it was
dynamic
really
score.
frustrating that no one else can see that, in my world at least.
No, no,
And
you're
I felt like
exactly
I was
right.
the only one who like really cared about video game music.
Well, I think it's partially because, we're invested in it. I mean, it was, that's such an important part of our childhood, but also other people's childhoods as well. And,
Yeah.
past that into adolescence as well, that it has a really strong hold and effect on people. And you really notice all the nuance in it. I mean, to soundtrack, I didn't mean to get, sidetracked into the Super Nintendo era, but we were kind of talking obviously about like the technological thing. And then I had to mention Donkey Kong Country, but I don't regret it.
Yeah, neither do I.
But the thing is that, we even mentioned it before when it came time for the original Game Boy having like 3 sound channels and a noise track. The earlier consoles actually had a limit of how many notes they could play at once, which means you have significantly less options to do what you want to do as
You
a
have to be a lot
composer, as a
smarter
sound
about what
designer.
you're writing too, as far as filling out your harmonies.
Yeah, you have to get creative and use implied harmonies, which is really cool. Actually, probably one of the best examples, and there's a fantastic channel on YouTube that if anybody watching has never heard of, 8-Bit Theory is a great
Oh,
channel.
I love that guy. 8-Bit Music
Yes,
Theory.
absolutely fantastic channel
Great A stuff.
that talks about like all the different instrumentations and different techniques used in soundtracks, and also has the music and like the Roman numeral analysis, and it is great for
Yeah,
anybody who's a
he
music buff out
dissects
there.
it on such a high level. I adore that channel. I love it.
Probably one of the best ones I've ever seen on there is a breakdown of Pokemon Gold and Silver soundtrack, talking about
Oh
implied
yeah.
harmony, and
Mhm.
it is fantastic. Talking about ideas of, since you can only use 3 notes at a time, if you need to get a chord that has more than 3 notes, you may have to use an implied harmony by basically like taking a bass line that covers 2 of those notes and alternating it real quickly, which
Mhm.
has the added benefit of giving more momentum, but it also gets you the notes you need,
Mhm.
which is awesome. It's a really, really innovative way to compose because there, I can't really think of another time another time in music history when it comes time for something that could be um, played on like a keyboard style interface where you would have had to have innovate quite so much due to a limitation. Like obviously, if you want to say, well, obviously the harpsichord couldn't like hold on to notes. Well, you're right. And a lot of harpsichord music, and Dan, you correct me if I'm wrong here, but a lot of harpsichord music has a lot of fast moving passages too,
Right.
given that,
To compensate for the lack of sustainability of the pitch.
versus a piano, obviously.
Yeah, a lot
And
more arpeggiations and scalar runs than you would see on piano.
and that kind of contributes to how composers compose for it and what benefits that offers versus different styles of music. I mean, we talked obviously briefly about the Pokemon soundtrack, but there's tons of examples of that. Like let's take the original Super Mario Bros. The opening chord, and we're going to get real deep into the nerdy music stuff here. The opening chord is supposed to be, I believe, a C9 with a sharp 11 in it. It winds up, I think, winds up having like a D in the bass, an F sharp,
And then an E on top. Yeah,
yeah.
it's basically, it starts off with a secondary dominant chord. It's a D dominant 9.
Is it a D dominant 9? Okay.
Yeah, because even the rest of that bar, the main melody has the E, which is the extension, but then it also does the C as well.
Yes, of course.
So yeah, it's pretty much a D9 to a G,
Sorry,
which is your 2 or 5 of 5, then 5, and then 1. It's in the key of C major. And of course, there are versions of it in lots of different keys now, that there are so many different renditions of it from all of the subsequent Mario Mania stuff that followed. But yeah, I remember, because that was before I even knew a lick of what secondary harmony was. And I remember I was listening to it, and like once I figured out the main melody and the bass part, I was like hearing this weird note in the middle, and I was like, is that an F sharp? And then I still remember being like 12, 13 years old and like picking that apart on the piano and then stacking it all together and like, whoa, that is really weird. Why does that sound so nice? There's like a whole bunch of notes that are like super crunchy, but it like works. And then of course, fast forward many years going to college and studying like secondary function in music, like theory and history classes, like And I'm sitting there making the connection. Oh yeah, it's like that. It's like that D9 in Super Mario Brothers.
I don't know why I thought it was a C. Oh, I know why I thought it was a C9. There's a C in the melody.
Yeah, and it's in the
That's
key of
why
C. It's a real easy misconception. You know, don't beat yourself up. But
oh, don't worry, I will.
I'll see you like posting your own comments on our video, like, "Oh, I messed this up. I am so mad at myself." So yeah, don't worry about it.
It's interesting because like for a chord that's a more complicated one of that style,
and to do it with just 3 notes on 3 channels.
Yeah. I mean, like that's is really interesting, and you can still hear the harmony there. It still works, and it sounds full enough. To sound good. I think part of that too has to do with like how spread apart the notes are as well, so it covers a decent range. But I mean, just being able to do that is impressive, because it basically says like, okay, what is the absolute minimum that I need to get
to convey my harmonies? And that's not even to mention the underground theme, which the original version of it is just single notes. And it outlines this really sophisticated circle of fifths progression with jazz extensions of a series of dominant sharp 9s to dominant 13s. And
I remember when you figured that one out after Mario Maker came out.
Yeah, because in Super Mario Maker, they had these little background jams that actually kind of filled in some of the missing harmonies. And like, I remember having such a tough time as a kid picking apart, like, this melody is just jumping all over the place. All these weird, like this, C down to an F sharp, and then an F to a B, and then a B flat to an E. It's doing all these weird little tritone jumps. And sure enough, it's a series of it outlines all the dominant 7s. And just in that melody alone, you could sketch out this whole really, really cool jazz progression. And I that's always a go-to for me. Like when I'm teaching like advanced harmony for like my own private students, I always use that as an example, because it's something that everyone who's ever played a video game has heard, Which
on its own sounds like randomness.
It's just goofy stuff, but when you put all the chords underneath it and you make that bass line, it works perfectly. And it's just mind-blowing how the composer Koji Kondo did it with just single notes. He doesn't even use all 4 of the channels.
We're gonna name drop his name a whole heck of a lot.
Yeah, he's kind of the godfather of a lot of modern game composition. He's, of course, attributed with all the Super Mario music in the later 80s and well throughout the 90s and 2000s. I think he's still involved with Nintendo, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh yeah, I mean,
he also did all the Star Fox music, right? Did he do all the Star Fox stuff?
That's kind of an interesting situation. I don't believe he was involved with the first one. I believe he was involved in 64, but that's kind of a weird contentious situation, because when it comes time for the first Star Fox and Star Fox 64, they both have really iconic soundtracks that are completely different from each other. A very rare case of where, like, inside the same franchise in a game, inside the same game, I can't say words, inside the same game franchise, you have completely different soundtracks that have totally different styles to them. The first Star Fox is much more a
little more rock oriented.
Yeah, it's like more rock oriented and kind of like even electronica to some extent.
Yeah.
But then you take a listen to like 64 and it's much more orchestral.
Yeah.
Which is such a big, weird difference. Like,
it's funny how both of those different styles lend themselves really well to accompany the game's scenes too. I've always found that.
The ironic part is that they both fit, which is weird. You wouldn't think they would, but for some reason it does.
Yeah.
It's kind of cool. I mean, that even highlights the fact that, from a composer standpoint, your direction that you take your composition influences basically like the first impression and also the general
perception of what that franchise should be.
Exactly. Like for a long time, I associated like, Latin music with Mario because it happened
so much. And even a lot of the 16-bit remasters of the 80s games that was featured on the Super Nintendo, it featured, Latin remixes of all of those games' music.
Yeah, and they're fantastic.
And they're really well done. It's kind of fascinating how much that Koji Kondo was able to do with so little.
We haven't even talked about Mario Kart yet.
Oh God. Well, that wasn't even just him. There was other composers for that, wasn't there? There was a whole team.
I think there was, but it's just interesting too, because like that style, like for those of you who are of the, the younger group and have played like Mario Kart 8 and know, like listening to like Dolphin Shoals with the saxophone solo that's in that kind of trend was started with Mario Kart 64 in terms of like having more like jazz. I always think of like the post race theme that goes on, like when they're tallying up the
little
scores.
Piano solo thing that just goes off the deep end there. Yeah, very cool.
And it's really cool because like on that side of it, you get this jazz side of Mario music that you won't always get in like the main games until later, and they use them in like Super Mario 3D World and stuff like that.
Yeah,
So
and I would argue that that even goes as far back as the original Super Mario Kart in 1992, because if you look at a track like Cooper
like
Beach
or Rainbow Road,
or Rainbow Road, well, Rainbow Road just because of the lush extended harmonies, like every single chord in that entire track is some kind of 7 or 9 or
absolutely.
11 or something really crazy. I remember we spent one Christmas holiday like just picking it apart and analyzing that, and like sitting at the piano and like blasting it on the TV and like just being completely mind blown of like how thick and rich and lush these harmonies are.
Rich is a really good word for it too. Rich and lush is a good
but even something like Koopa Troopa Beach has like a lot of like Latin piano stuff, and there's like a little solo like toward the end of the loop. So there's little hints of it even on the limited technology of the Super Nintendo in 1992. But yeah, it's kind of cool to see like how that continued to just further go in that direction. And by the time you hit, what is it? Mario Kart 7 even had like really, really like fleshed out jazz works. And then that only was expounded upon tenfold in the sequel that was dropped on the Wii U a few years later.
And the thing is that, like, again, we're name dropping Koji Kondo again, but this guy did an amazing job of introducing like styles of music to thousands, millions of kids who might not have heard it. I don't know if I would have actually had like much of an introduction to jazz music until I got involved in being in jazz band in middle school, had I not heard that from Mario games, which is astounding to me, which is kind of the part of me that, makes it feel like, I don't know why this isn't more legitimate. This is introducing styles of music that you wouldn't hear, but you wouldn't typically find without going and looking for it.